Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or as we say in Papiamento, bon dia, bon tardi, bon noche. Welcome to the second session for today, plenary session as part of the 21st International Conference on Diversity in Organizations, Communities, and Nations. We are very happy to be holding this session here live from the University of Curacao. Once again, I, Joanne Costa Gomez, will be your moderator for this session. This session will be about the economic impact. So we will be having some very interesting speakers today who will be talking about some topics regarding economic impact during the COVID-19 crisis, but of course with a vision as to what will be the next step. As we know, the theme for this year is economic resilience and sustainable development in times of crisis. So, of course, very important. First, before we begin, of course, some rules for this. As we know, this is virtual. We're in the digital world now. We all know because of the COVID-19, all our global participants couldn't be here live with us in Curacao. I want to state once again a warm welcome for next year. Remember to mark in your agenda for the 2nd till the 4th of June 2022, we will be having the 22nd International Conference here in Curacao, and we cannot wait to welcome you on our beautiful island. Let's start with the rules. Of course, via the live stream from the University of Curacao, you are allowed to ask your questions in the chat box. Of course, our preference is not to be engaging and chatting in the chat box, but just use it for questions. And you can also send your questions to our WhatsApp that we have provided on the link. I will repeat the number in a bit again, so you can send your questions, but the questions will be asked by the end of all three presentations. We will be having three speakers, and without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker for today. We have engineer Luello Girigori. He's the representative of the Ministry of Economic Development. The title of his presentation will be The Economic Impact of COVID Pandemic on the Economy of Curacao and the government measures to mitigate the effect and to jumpstart the economy. And as we know, Curacao is a starting point in these discussions, but of course, for all of you tuning in from all around the globe, we are sure that our experience here on the island will serve you and be of a great added value for your processes as well. So the point will be how to mitigate the effect and jumpstart the economy. And Luello Girigori is the person to talk about this. Of course, seeing that since the 1990s, he's been having a very broad, ample experience as a policymaker here on the island. More than around 2 decades in leadership positions as head of the General Economic Policy Department from 2003 to 2010 of the Department of Economics Affairs, and the last 10 years as Policy Director of the Ministry of Economic Development. So it's safe to say that when it comes to this topic, he's definitely one of the experts on the island to talk about it. He's got a very long list of publications under his belt, publications ranging in areas of macroeconomic stability, economic structure enhancement, creating boundary conditions, and spearheads sectors. So very interesting. And of course, a very interesting detail is he has university degrees from the Faculty of Technical Science, but on the other hand, he also has a Master of Science in Accountancy, majoring in Public Controller. So a very interesting combination, I'm sure, which will help into giving us a very unique perspective into policy making in these times as well. I want to give the floor to Luello Girigori.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you for the word. As you mentioned, my name is Luello Girigori. I will address the point of the economic impact of the pandemic on the economy of Curacao. During my presentation, I will go to this content, which is where are we right now, taking consideration the global effect of the COVID-19, the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy of Curacao, and how from the government side we just mitigating the impact of COVID-19 And as last, I will address a little bit about the jumpstart, the instrument that we use in order for for the government to jumpstart once again to the economy, and the preview that we have taken account of a model that we use to calculate the impact on what we are expecting for the coming years regarding the economic impact for the island. Before I start, I would like to jump into the global economy just to show some figures in order to put everything in context. Actually, as you can see within this graphic, we just took a little impression of the global with regard to the economic impact with regard to the COVID. As you may see, it varies from an economic impact of a negative economic impact from 3.8% up to more or less 7.5%, with some exemption, which are the Panama and Venezuela, which we can expect it. But as mentioned, actually, it's very good to take those figures with us, because actually when we address in Curacao, it will be very particular to see from how huge the impact will be on Curacao. As you can see, with regard to 2021, we expected a growth from the different sectors that they bounce back within the economy. As you can see, to take one, United States has bounced back, and as information we get from the IMF, it will be an increase of 6.4%. So you can see from, for the other side, there are countries that within a region that within 1 year will bounce back. If we just take once the Caribbean and Latin America region is where we belong to, you will see from they will bounce back this year already with increasement from their economy from 4.6%. If we just zoom a little bit in Curacao with regards to what we are expecting from the impact of COVID, if you took in consideration the impact of turnover loss with regards to the different sector, the sector that has been hit mostly, if we begin from above, you will see that manufacturing has been hit, like say from more than 50%. With regards to the following, the transportation sector is another one sector that has been hit very hard with COVID with regard to the turnover losses, and accommodation and food sector is the other one with 65% of turnover loss. And as last one, I would like to mention the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector, which has been hit by the COVID in terms of turnover very hard. If you took those impact on the several sector, it's become from what will be the economic impact. And I have to mention here is this is excluding the retention initiative and the government budget support from the Netherlands. You will see that we will have a decrease in the economy, the real economic growth, from minus 26%, and with an unemployment rate that will be almost more than 12,000 jobs that will have been lost if there were no intervention of the government on that side. And the government is expected to lose on income more or less $340 million within the impact of COVID based on the first impact of the pandemic in April last year. Actually, as I mentioned, if you see Curacao, we will see that in 2020, the impact of COVID was very hard. And if you just go back to the first sheet that I'm just showing, there you can see that the other countries and region are talking about more or less 3.5 up to 7% decrease, while Curacao has been hitting for 26%. Actually, if you go back into history to see from the trend of the GDP of Curacao, we will see that within the last 10 years, Curacao economy has oscillating around zero, which means that we have actually an economy that, besides the fact that it's not growing or shrinking very hard, with exception with 2018 and 2019, where you see a decrease from more than 2.2 or more than 3.4. You can conclude that we have an economy which is very rigid, that we have to take some action if we want to bring Curacao back on an economic growth that's bigger of, in any case, in trend of what we have been seen within the region, which is among 3 to 4% economic increase, then we have to do more than only jumpstart the economy. In order for the government to mitigate a little bit the effect of COVID, a twofold approach has been carried out. One of those approaches has been business retention in order to mitigate the effect of COVID-19. Some of those measures I will just mention within a few seconds. But the other side, the other approach has been the business development in order to jumpstart the economy. Actually, it was two approaches I mentioned, and with the first one is like stopping the bleeding, helping the business on Curacao to go forward in order to waiting that we can just jumpstart the economy on the further in the coming years. Those initiative that has been taken by the government by the time was the job loss support for the recent unemployment, wage supports aimed to protecting jobs and income, temporary support for self-employed entrepreneurs, reimbursement of fixed costs, SME credit support aimed to retain the income of self-employed entrepreneurs up to a certain extent, and the coaching for supporting of SME. With regard to the business development side, as I mentioned, one of the instruments that we will use for sure, that the government intends to use, is the introduction of a guarantee fund for business development. And besides that, as I mentioned, if we cannot push or jumpstart the economy if we don't take structural measures with regard to the reforms that have to be in place. And some of the points that have to be addressed within the reforms are for sure the flexibility of the labor market, the tax regime, red tape, and actually we developed another instrument like the guarantee funds, which is the big ticket item, which follow-up will be addressed within this presentation. If you take in consideration the business retention initiative on the social part, the government has concentrated a little bit on the job lost with regard from March up to now, that $90 million dollars has been spent in the people that lose their jobs. Social welfare for so far also within more than 12 months. 19.19 million has been addressed to those people that lose their jobs. And besides that, the government received a support from the Dutch Netherlands from more or less $364 million up to now. I have to mention that we are covering the period from starting April up to June this year. And afterwards, we have to see if we will get more grants, or if it will be loans, whatever it may be. But in any case, that point has to be addressed within the future. With regard to the enterprises retention initiative that has been put in place, one of them is the guarantee of the now, which is support for wages. There we are talking that within more than 1 year, the government has spent more or less $68.5 million regarding the reimbursement of fixed costs. The amount of 21.8 million has been granted up to now to those company which has been subscribed for this arrangement of initiative. Besides that, with regards to the SME, loans has been granted. There's loans at a low rate of interest via credits, credits, and Corpodeco with almost 1 million, and the coaching program with training and things on for the SMEs. Almost 0.3 million has been dedicated to that part of the initiative. And for temporary support for self-employed entrepreneurs, a 16.2 million has been given up to now for that sector. If you just dive into a little bit for what means the business retention initiative with regard to the now initiative, we can see from the turnover loss from those companies that has applied for the initiative, you can see a amount of 49% of their losses up to almost 80% of turnover loss has been increased, or has been those company has been suffered from during the period of April 2020 up to April 2021. At the left side in the table you can see also the amount of company that has been applied and approved regarding this initiative. The amount of job that has been guaranteed by making use of this initiative has been between 18,000 jobs and almost 5,000 and something jobs, meaning that those company that has applied and have received loans for those workers, this is the amount of workers that actually have been retained to the work, taking consideration of the guarantee that they have received from the government. In the table aside, you will see the amount of money that has been paid up to now for each month regarding these funds with regard to the jobs retention for the company. With regard to the fixed cost support, this initiative is given for each quarter. We started by the third quarter of 2020. There you can see from the amount of more or less 300 something very constant amount of enterprises have applied for this support, totalizing the amount of 28.1 million that have been spent. The same goes for the self-employed entrepreneurs. You will see from the first 3 months the amount of more than 3,000, almost 3,500 applications have been submitted and also approved. On the other side, you will see 3,000 have been approved. Those are self-employed people from companies that have been paid with this initiative for the last 12 of 13 months. And then you can see also the amount of money that has been addressed. If you just goes back from taking consideration the amount of money that the government received from the Dutch government in order to be able to implement those retention initiative. If you take that in consideration, that we will see that the economy will, the impact of the COVID has been mitigated from 26.6% up to 19.3%. And that we will see that the employment also, which we are talking about more or less 12,000 employees that has been will have been lost. You will see that almost 3,000 jobs were lost during that period of time. To step over to the development, business development, actually a study has been conducted between the central bank and the Curacao Development Institute, where they just went and see from, okay, within the spearhead sector that we have on the island, which are those companies of enterprise that have some projects that are right now in the pipelines, but they are not carried out owing to the fact that they don't have enough collateral to be getting loans. And actually, the amount, the study shows that the amount of almost $418 million on projects are in pipelines, meaning that they are ready, they can be implemented, but they have to have some types of guarantee in order for them to be accomplished. Taking that in consideration, there is an instrument that has been developed. Actually, the intention is to start with small and medium-sized enterprises. This instrument is calling the guarantee funds. The aim is to, for small enterprises, to start with these funds and give them an access to up to $200,000, which means that 75% of the collateral will be guaranteed by these funds, and the owner of the project have to have 25% of the collateral in order to get access to these guarantee funds. And for the medium-sized company, we are talking about that they will have access to this fund up to $1.5 million. It means that the 50% of the collateral will be guaranteed by the government, and the owner themselves have to have collateral in place of almost 50%. By saying so, this will give us the opportunity to start with some process and getting them out of the pipeline and let them start, which will give impulse, a jump start to the economy. That's the way that the government want to attack this issue. I have to recognize that we don't have enough funds because with 20 million that were available, it's not enough to jumpstart, but in any case, it's an initial start for us in order to start with the development of the economy, pending from more money that we will have in order to push the other projects that are right now in the pipeline. The duration of the guarantee will be more or less of 6 years. It depends on the type and the amount of money that they will use. With regard to the strengthened economic structure, I will go fast within this part. Actually, there are several areas that have to be addressed. Starting with the investment promotion, we have investment agent, but as we know, we have to redesign and refigure from where we're heading to. We are right now evaluating the agency, and we hope to just come up with a new concept and start again and hope that we will get more FDI. But that is also one of the problems that we have right now on the island. The other point that have to be addressed is to simplify the tax regime, as we have to shift from direct to indirect tax. Another area that needs some attention is the permit size, is the red tape to the red carpet treatment that we have to give to the investment that are willing to invest their money on the island. And on that part, we have to digitalize and revision and streamline the process of giving permits, which is very important in order to give very short notice the permits. Besides that, the intention is to reduce the HORECA permits from 10 down to 2 permits, which is more easier to give and to come up with a permit instead of have 10 different permits to give. And as I mentioned, with regard to the flexible of labor market, there are some points that we have to tackle there. One of them is the vocational school. As we know, between the island must have a vocational of technical school, which we don't have since some years already, which is one of the problems that we have. Besides that, we have to streamline the education because now we are preparing people which are not meeting the needs of the private sectors. We have to streamline, how you will say it, the education system with the labor market. Besides that, some revision have to be taking place regarding the labor market law that we have right now in place. Besides that, the SME, as I mentioned, the policy will be implemented, aiming to support service, coaching, financial loan, and financial loans that have to be given. Saying that, if you just put everything together, as I mentioned, the tax reform, together with the instrument that I mentioned to jumpstart the economy, the guarantee funds, and taking consideration that the refinery will be once again with the third part of the third quarter of this year operational, and if we take into account that private investment will be done within the coming years from more or less 125 million on yearly basis, and that the government will be invested $50 million yearly during now up to 2025, then we will get the following result with regard to the economic growth. We are expecting this year economic growth of 2.9. That is based, as I mentioned, one of those issue that we took within our calculation is that the refinery will be operational at the third quarter, and so on, and we will take for the further on, let's say for the 2022 up to 2025, that we will have a refinery, and besides that, as I mentioned, within the other sector that I mentioned, those activities will be carried out. By saying that, I will have to emphasize that that plan, if we just implement it like it is planned right now, we will generate almost 50,000 new jobs up to 2025. Having said that, I will say thank you for your attention, and will hand the word over to the moderator.
Thank you to Luelo Girigori, representative of the Ministry of Economic Development here on the island, for very, very, very interesting insights. I'm sure everybody watching is taking conclusions, comparing to their own countries, but everybody from Curacao watching as well, I'm sure you've learned a lot, and it has given you a great insight as to what we can expect for this year and what the risk factors are. I want to encourage everyone, once again, you can use the chat box in the link of the live stream to ask your questions. If you prefer to send them more privately, you can. We have arranged a WhatsApp number. Our code, of course, 0059999, so 5999 is our code for Curacao, and the number is 562-2121. So 5999-562-2121. You can send your WhatsApp via WhatsApp your questions. I will see them, and I will ask the questions at the end of the session. It is now time for Dr. José Jardim. Dr. José Jardim is the Executive Director of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Martin since 2017. Present, he's responsible for the economic and monetary policy, financial stability, resolution, and legal division of the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Martin. He will be speaking on the fiscal activism in the Caribbean amid the deep economic crisis. I'm sure everyone can understand the importance of this topic as well. And if there is anyone I could say that is the one that can be speaking about this topic here in Curacao, is Dr. José Jardim, because next to now being the Executive Director of the Central Bank of Curacao, Dr. José Jardim has been in the past as well Minister of Finance here on our island for 4 consecutive years, having done a lot on this subject as well for our communities. So he has a broad experience and knowledge in this matter. Apart from this, he has valuable international experience as well, studied in Portugal, worked in the private sector, worked an ample amount of years in the public sector here in Curacao in the Ministry of Finance as well. Of course, a lot of experience also as chairman of different supervisory boards, a lot of publications under his name as well. So without further ado, and like I said, with the introduction of the person that can now be giving us a very interesting insight on this matter of fiscal activism in the Caribbean amid the deep economic crisis, which for sure will be interesting for many of you as well. Preparing. Let's put the presentation. I want to welcome and give the floor to Dr. José Jardim.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Joanne. Can we go back to the presentation? Because... no, to my presentation, as a matter of fact. Can we enlarge it? No. Okay, let's try it this way then. Okay, thank you so much. Once again, thank you for the introduction. The topic of this presentation will be about fiscal activism in the Caribbean amid the deep economic contraction caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. I will be following more or less the following structure for this presentation. We will be covering some developments in the world economy with a special emphasis on the economy in the Caribbean area. We will be assessing some Caribbean countries. As a matter of fact, I would like to clarify that the selection of the countries that are included in this presentation was primarily determined also by the availability of data. What we have been experiencing is that many countries in the region have some delays in producing some data which are relevant for analysis. In the second place, what we also encounter is that there are several consistency issues when using data. So that forced us as well, for instance, not to use the official figures. For instance, when you look at the figures of Curacao, you will see that we use slightly different figures than those that are being reported by the official authorities, and that's due to the fact that we are mainly using data as produced by the IMF. In the second place, what is also what we will be covering is then we will be making some comparisons with the Caribbean area. We will be also touching the situation in the EU and the USA, although the economies are completely different, but it's very important for us for the way forward regarding the economy of Curacao particularly. When we look at the economy of the global economy, then it must be clarified that the global economy has been experiencing the worst economic contraction of this century and also of the last decades. And this is mainly due to the fact that, like we know, the COVID-19 caused almost 80 million infections last year, and it also caused the death of almost 2 million people. These figures have more or less doubled since the beginning of this year, which emphasizes that the pandemic has a very profound impact on the society. The world economy contracted last year by 3.3%. If we look at, for instance, this graph, then you may see that the contraction has been more severe in the developed world. So comparing the advanced economies with those, the emerging and developing economies, then you see that the economic contraction has been more profound in the advanced world. We will be touching this in a while as well. In the Caribbean area, what has happened? Actually, the Caribbean economy has contracted by almost 14%. In the last year. This is especially the case in tourism-dependent economies, and this is due to containment measures, but also due to the fact that containment measures abroad affect also the source of tourists for the islands. And of course, one thing that has been affecting the whole Caribbean region is, of course, the cruise tourism, which was suspended last year as well. When we look at the figures, we see also that there is a sharp increase in unemployment in the Caribbean area for the islands that are being considered in this presentation, once again, due to the availability of data. And what you can also observe is that the fiscal balance worsened substantially in the region. Let's take a look at the real GDP growth. If you look, for instance, at the Caribbean, once again, the economy is contracted almost 14%. But if we look especially at Curacao and Aruba, which are the two Dutch Caribbean islands contained in the presentation, then you can observe that while the Aruba economy contracted more or less 25%, the Curacao economy contracted about 20%. This is quite higher than the average of the Caribbean countries selected in this sample. When we look at the unemployment rate, the situation is not very different. Once again, here the sample is much smaller because we were not able to obtain information about the other Caribbean economies. But what you can see is that while the unemployment rate increased substantially in Curacao from about 17 to about 24% last year, you can see that Aruba's unemployment increased much more, absolutely, but also relatively. The worst performance in this sample was exhibited by the Bahamas, which increased from about 10% to over 25% unemployment. We will be covering this topic because if we go back to this slide, then you see that there were three colors being used. The Caribbean is the gray one is the average of the Caribbean. Then you look at the light blue; those are the most tourism-dependent economies, and the dark blue ones are the less dependent tourism-dependent economies. Curacao was classified as a tourism-dependent economy, although we will be highlighting that it's quite different than other countries in the region. If we move on to the government fiscal balance, here the picture is quite similar once again. It's applicable to Aruba and Curacao. A very sharp increase of the fiscal balance. So Aruba recorded last year a budget deficit in excess of 15%, while Curacao more or less reached the 20%. When we look at the other islands, and this will be more or less also visible in the other slides, because we should keep in mind, like the previous speaker mentioned, there was financial support granted from the Netherlands, which made it possible to finance, on the one hand, the government budget, on the other hand, also to finance some aid to the private sector. If it were not for the financial assistance from the Netherlands, most probably Curacao and Aruba would not differ from the rest of the Caribbean region. So these very large fiscal deficits are mainly caused by the crisis, but they were able more or less due to the financial assistance from the Netherlands. So what we saw in the previous slide, it is the deterioration of fiscal balance, which was mainly due to two factors, the financial aid to the private sector and also the operation of the automatic fiscal stabilizers. The automatic fiscal stabilizers are mainly intended to dampen, to more or less to limit the business cycle. Whenever you have a stronger economic growth, that translates into less, for instance, unemployment benefits, higher taxes, that dampens the growth cycle, while when contracting, it happens the opposite way. What you may infer from the figures from Curacao and Aruba is that Aruba and Curacao had no difficulty in allowing the automatic fiscal stabilizers to work completely independent of the limited financial means, because those financial means were more or less guaranteed by the Netherlands. Fiscal activism. We have more or less used for this to measure the fiscal activism. We have used more or less the way that it was measured by Paul de Grauwe for some European countries, which is a very simple ratio. It is the ratio between the change in the government budget deficit over the change in economic growth ratio. So whenever you have a ratio in excess of 1, that means that the government is reacting even much more to the economic crisis than compared to the contraction of the economy. What is then the situation if we look at this ratio? Once again, we may infer from this graph that the Caribbean as a region had very limited possibilities to react to the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. Like we saw, the contractions were substantial. Nonetheless, what we see is that most of the Caribbean countries have a fiscal activism ratio of less than 0.5. On the contrary, Curacao exceeds 1, so that means that Curacao has been very active in trying to react to the economic and social crisis caused by the pandemic. Aruba records an indicator of 0.7, which is lower than Curacao, but still much higher than the Caribbean region. When we look at the behavior of the authorities around the globe, we may distinguish three types of actions that were employed, that were used by the authorities. We have what we call above-the-line measures, which are measures which directly affect the budget deficit, and these may contain the financing of unemployment benefits. It may also include deferral of tax payments and so on. These were the ones used in the Caribbean area, while, for instance, in Europe and the US, you have seen below-the-line measures, which are, for instance, loans to enterprises. You can also see off-budget actions, which may include, for instance, quasi-fiscal operations, such as loans by state-owned banks. When we look once again comparing the countries included in this sample for the Caribbean area, you see that Aruba is very active in supporting the private sector. It spent more or less 9% of its GDP supporting the private sector, compared to a Caribbean region which does not exceed 4%. Curacao was about 4.1%. So while in one of the previous graphs, we saw that Curacao had a very pronounced fiscal activism, what you may infer from combining those graphs is that fiscal activism was mainly by financing the own government budget, not by substantially financing the private sector. If we look at the figures, the financial aid that was granted by the Netherlands, about 3/4 of those funds were used to finance the government budget, and only 1/4 was used to finance the aid, the assistance to the private sector. This is also visible in the following slide, which shows you that once again, it were mainly the European Union and the USA which had a pronounced fiscal activism last year. Nonetheless, if you look once again at Aruba and Curacao and you compare it to the emerging economies and also the low-income developing countries, then you see that our fiscal activism was comparable to the ones that you saw in Europe and in the USA, and this is mainly due to the financial assistance from the Netherlands. I won't be bothering you too long for the fiscal multipliers. The idea of the fiscal multipliers is more or less what is the impact of on the economy going out from the government budget when you change taxes or change your spending behavior. One thing that we should keep in mind is that whenever you take the fiscal multiplier, this one is much lower, for instance, in the Caribbean area compared to the European Union or the USA, because we are talking about small, very open economies, which means that you have a very substantial leakage effect, which means that the impact from government actions on the economy, on the real economy, is much more limited to compared to other much substantial economies. The case of Curacao, there's a report which was published by the Central Bank of Curacao and St. Martin, which clarified that the fiscal multiplier is being estimated between 0.2 and 0.6. So this means that the economic benefit from the aid assistance to the private sector has been estimated by the Central Bank between 0.5 and 1.4% in 2020. One aspect that we also want to highlight, because this will be useful at the end of the presentation as well, is the government gross debt. Because whenever, as a country, you have a lot of you have a high debt burden that may limit your possibilities to finance assistance to the private sector. When you look at the figures, you can see that the Caribbean area is a very indebted area. Nonetheless, once again, Curacao and Aruba had the luxury to benefit from assistance from the Netherlands, which allowed the countries to finance vast support for the economy and social matters. Then let's take a look at the international comparison. This graph consists of 4 subgraphs. The first one, I don't know whether it's clearly visible, but when we look at the first section, this one compares fiscal activism versus real GDP growth. From this section, you can infer, for instance, that the USA was by far the most fiscal active country in the world. On the other hand, we are including USA and the European Union in this graph, not because you should be aware that the USA and the European Union economy cannot be compared to economies in the Caribbean area, but especially because we want to distinguish in the effect of public policies on the economy when you compare vast economies like the European Union's and the USA's to Aruba and Curacao. When you look especially for Curacao and you consider that the fiscal activism was in excess of 1, like we saw before, it was 1.1, and you see that the economic contraction was still 20%, that means 2 things. In the first place, that the fiscal activism was not able to really limit the economic contraction. This has to do with the fact that there's a lot of leakage from the expenditure side from the government budget, because once you spend, you have a lot of imports. That means that leaks abroad, so you don't have the full benefit of the government spending. On the other hand, the European Union and the USA, on the other hand, have much more substantial economic domestic sectors, which implies that whenever the government is spending, a larger fraction of that spending is benefiting the real economy, the real domestic economy. When we look also at the change of unemployment, more or less the same applies. You can see that the European Union was initially very successful in containing an increase of unemployment. The unemployment increase is less than 1 percentage point, 2020 compared to 2019. The USA recorded a growth of unemployment in excess of 4%, but especially Curacao and Aruba with increases in excess of 6%, very clarify the limited impact of all the fiscal activism in solving the economic and unemployment issues related to the pandemic. When we look, and I will go to the 4th subgraph, which is the fiscal activism versus the general government debt. Of course, if you look at the USA, they have a very high debt burden. On the other hand, they don't have any limitations when issuing debt. So that means that they were able to finance the assistance program for this crisis. On the other hand, Curacao and Aruba, they were not constrained by their public debt ratios because they got the assistance from the Netherlands as well. One graph that we wanted to include in this presentation as well, and I hope this is also visible. We wanted to compare those countries that for which we had data on unemployment to take a look into their concentration, so their diversification of their economy, but also their dependency on tourism. Unfortunately, you don't have national statistics which properly measure the size of the tourism industry. But if you look at the national accounts and you look, for instance, at the figures that are related to hotels and restaurants, which is more or less the one of the gray ones, for Aruba it's the one measuring 19%, then you can see that while Aruba was 19% and the Bahamas was almost 11%, you can see that in Curacao it was less than 6%. So the Curacao economy is still less dependent on tourism. Nonetheless, When you have, this means that when you have containment measures domestically taken by the authorities of Curacao, this means that it is affecting a larger share of the domestic economy, but when you have containment measures abroad, the impact domestically might be slightly smaller than compared, for instance, to Aruba. Nonetheless, what you see is that the economic performance of Curacao was actually the second worst in the Caribbean area. So that means that we seconded, as a matter of fact, Aruba, which recorded the largest contraction. And so this might imply that the figures are being contaminated also by the closure of the refinery still, which might affect the situation. On the other hand, it might also have to do with the fact that the program that was designed by the government of Curacao was less beneficial for the private sector compared to other areas. Because if you have only 4% of GDP being spent to assist the private sector, and most of the funds are being used to finance the government budget deficit, that means that the benefits for keeping the jobs and also to more or less solve the social situation on the island is much more limited than if you were to have used more funds. What is, because I'm already in the conclusion areas, as a matter of fact, because we have already seen that the Caribbean economies have recorded a substantial contraction of the GDP, that there is a substantial increase in unemployment rate, that the public finances have worsened. Nonetheless, what you see is that Curacao and Aruba were more or less outliers in the Caribbean area. This was mainly thanks to the financial assistance from the Netherlands, which made it possible for the islands to finance their government budgets, but also assistance to the private sector. However, when we look at the situation in Curacao, and just keep in mind, Curacao recorded a contraction of about 20%, the unemployment increased from 17 to about 24%. This means that the initial intention of the authorities was more or less to prevent many job losses and to be able to cope with the social situation on the island. When you have an increase of unemployment of 7%, the big question is, are these employees that were dismissed where the employers cease to exist, or are they still existing entities? Because if they still exist, that means that once that the global economy starts growing, it will be very easy for them to rehire their former employees and to restart operations. But if these entities simply cease to exist, that means that it will be much more difficult for the economy of Curacao to grow. And that's the benefit of this kind of conferences as well. We saw the projection from the Ministry of Economic Development. I would say that rather, because when you look at those projections, we are very more cautious regarding the economic growth projections for Curacao in the near future. As a matter of fact, when we look at the economic contraction and the unemployment growth, what we expect is that the growth might be quite slower, rather a U-shaped. I don't know whether you remember that initially a lot of people were asking, will the recovery be a U-shaped or V-shaped? V-shaped means that the economic recovery will be very fast. That would be the case if unemployment would have been kept more or less the same, because that means that you just have to restart operations. Now that we have recorded a substantial increase in unemployment, we have some doubts whether the recovery will be that fast. In the second place, what is also very important is that when we look at the figures of all the Caribbean areas, and we look at, for instance, the figures exhibited by the European Union and the USA, one conclusion may be that, that active public policies, either by spending more or by cutting taxes, are less effective in an open, small economy as Curacao. So the focus should be, and that is also highlighted in the third bullet on this slide, the need to strengthen the resilience of the economy in the first place by diversifying the economy. So I think that everyone supports the growth of the tourism industry. However, what is really necessary is for us not only to be focusing on the tourism industry, and it is really necessary to pay proper attention to the diversification of the economy, not by reversing the economic focus, but by rebalancing. So Curacao had several economic sectors which were very important and that may be growing less or even contracted, also due to the lack of attention they deserve for the last couple of years. In the second place, what is also very important, as Aruba and Curacao had the chance to obtain financing from the Netherlands, it is also very important for us to foster sound public finances, because if we had not had the financial assistance from the Netherlands, we would not have had the possibility to assist anyone on the island. So that means sound public finances to build up fiscal buffers so that we can support the citizens and the business when it is necessary. And once again, contrary to a more demand-driven policy perspective, what is more important are economic reforms. I would like to emphasize three areas: education, labor market. A lot of people usually think about labor market reforms. They usually think about making it easier to fire employees. The reforms of the labor market should primarily be focused to increase productivity. That would be the main focus. The capital market, financing of businesses should be much broader to make it also more attractive for business to establish themselves on the island. And in the last point is the public apparatus. And this refers to the size. You need to take a look into the size, because especially if you need to conclude that from the fiscal activism that Curacao exhibited last year, almost 3/4 of the funds were used to finance the public apparatus. That means that we really need to take a look into the size of the public apparatus. But also, the previous speaker also mentioned the licensing. It is really important to take a look into the licensing, especially if the employees that lost their jobs last year, if their employer ceased to exist and there needs to be new employers to be registered on the island, it is very important for licensing to be changed. Digitalization, like was emphasized by the previous sector, is very important. Also to make it more transparent for businesses to establish themselves in Curacao especially. So this would call for more or less a more structural approach from the supply side, make it more attractive for businesses to establish themselves on the island. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, and we will be open during the panel discussion for questions. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. José Jardim, Executive Director of the Central Bank of Curacao and Sint Maarten. We have one more speaker. I want to once again encourage everyone to send in their questions if they like via WhatsApp 599-562-2121, or you can do that via the chat box in the live stream. Lots of information. I'm sure you all have a lot of remarks and questions. Feel free to send these. Our third and final speaker for this session, this afternoon, Curacao hours, is Guy Kozijn. Guy is an economist with experience in the insurance, banking, pension fund, business services, and government industry. As an entrepreneur and advisor, he is involved in issues and challenges around the economy, sustainability, resilience, and life. Of course, this is an economic discussion, and as we all know, economics, or at least my interpretation of economics, is it's nothing more and has everything to do with human behavior. So he is going to talk about life, human behavior around this. Guy Kozijn is a writer, including for columns and text and speech writing for executives. As a member also of the COVID Emergency Fund here in Curacao, he has greatly contributed to the setup of models and programs to support employment in the private sector. So I'm sure you'll find that all the three speakers in their presentation will find each other in giving you a very realistic and multidimensional view of what has been going on in Curacao, which of course will greatly add to a very valuable discussion afterwards. Guy is also a lecturer at the University of Curacao, and he's a trainer, talent development program for Bonaire, the Dutch Ministry of Internal Affairs. And as a writer, he's currently working on a series of pocket books on economics that are more digestible and meaningful and solution-oriented. So I am sure now you are very eager to feel a little of this digestible, meaningful, and solution-oriented vibe in his speech. Reconnected in a Disconnected World is the title of the presentation. And Guy said it's about life. So let's hear it.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. And, well, a big hello to the virtual community. Welcome for attending this presentation. Actually, my presentation, and thank you for the two previous speakers for your insights on the economic development. Actually, my presentation is going to be different. And as already been announced, since the pandemic broke out last year, our lives have been influenced, impacted in many, many ways. And therefore, I could not let the opportunity go to start with actually the core of the life, which is actually the living cell. The living cell, the way it is depicted here in the slide, is a visible one. And as a, let's say, imaginary presentation, I used the world, our world, presented as the living cell, because in reality, we cannot see with our bare eyes the living cell, because it's only very, very tiny, only a couple of micrometers in diameter. So we need microscopes to study them. So what can we say about the living cell? First of all, the living cell requires resources, such as water, nutrients. These are captured from the external environment, taken through the cell wand. Another word for the cell wand is the surface. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And it comes into the cell. Just like any animal and human beings, cells produce waste. So they need to get rid of the waste. So that waste goes out of the cell, through the cell wand, the cell membrane. And the third one is that cells exchange actually energy. They require energy, but they also give energy back to the environment. So now there's an interesting thing to see. Let's go to another discipline of science, which is physics. And there is a certain law of physics that relates to the geometric object, the way it is depicted here, which is Earth, a sphere. And what does that law of physics say about the sphere? It says that when you take the ratio of the surface, symbol S, divided by the volume, the outcome is equal to 3 divided by R. And R is actually the radius, which is the distance from the middle of the cell towards the surface of the cell. So as the radius is growing, meaning as the cell is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, the ratio of the surface in proportion to the volume is decreasing. So that means that that surface that is smaller in proportion to the volume needs to deal with bigger resources, bigger wastes, and bigger exchanges of energy to be able to survive. And that's why in nature, cells, the living cell, is small. So the question then is, in nature, what are the economies of scale? In nature, the economies of scale actually are the living cell, which is small by nature. So one conclusion we can already make is that the economies of scale do not follow the law of physics. So now going from this living cell, let's look at the human behavior, the economy, because actually the economy is the consequence of our human behavior, both from the supply side and the demand side. And the current context we're in actually makes it very important to analyze three questions about the economy. First of all, how we produce. Second, how income is distributed. And the third one, how we consume. So let's go to the economies of scale in the economy. What can we say about that? Well, they focus on cost advantages in order to produce big volumes of one good. Well, I was thinking of an example, and actually I am from Belgium, so I came up with an example of a beer company. So you see here in the slides a beer company, and for the process of the beer, they need those big fermentation tanks, cylinders, an object. So thinking of the law of physics and applying it on these cylinders, what does that mean? It means that the bigger the cylinder, the smaller the surface in relation to the volume. The surface is the body of the cylinder, and the volume is actually the beer. Oh, this is very important for an entrepreneur, because in order to have a big tank, I can better use a big object in comparison to a small object, because I need to pay less for the metal, for the material. So what we can conclude actually in the economy is that the economies of scale do follow the law of physics. So now going to the real world in which we are living, you see all kinds of symbols and brands of major companies around the world. And today's economy is a lot more, of course, than machines, than mechanization. Because you have those big power companies, but you also have, for example, the big tech industry. And I was actually, let's say, influenced and also intrigued by Rana Foroohar, who is an international, a global economic analyst for CNN, also a writer for the Financial Times. And she wrote a book on the big tech industry that she calls a monopoly power. And literally, her quote is, "These firms are making higher amounts of profit margins with lower amounts of labor costs than any other company in history." Now, think about the second question I asked, how income is distributed. What it means is that actually these companies are hollowing out the middle class. And that takes me in my journey with you from nature to the economy to the risk side of the battle. So how about the risks? Every year, at the beginning of the year, there is a global risks report elaborated by the World Economic Forum. And actually, two groups are part of the survey, all around the globe, influentials all around the globe. The older population, business leaders from all kinds of companies around the world and institutions, and the younger generation, which is also resembling and gathering and talking about, our world and the future. And mainly the risks are encompassing these 5 categories. And when you look at this slide, actually you see lots of green. Green referring to the environmental risks. And look at this, because I'm not talking about the risks for tomorrow immediately. I'm talking here about the risks for the next decade. And what are we seeing here? And this happened for the first time. Before the virus became the pandemic last year, in 2020, just before we had the pandemic, and the report was released, for the first time in history, the risks by likelihood were all environmentally related. The top 5 of the risks, for the first time in history, both recognized by the older and the younger generation. The next year after that, in 2021, of course, you see those diseases, which is quite normal because we had the pandemic that goes and then stems in through the minds of the people. The second thing then is that the risks by impact also overwhelmingly are related to the environmental risks. And this actually gives us important information. While I'm going to this next slide, I'm just going to briefly give you the difference between the younger and the older generation. When we take the risks of the environment in consideration and the social risks, actually what you see in these slides is that the younger generation is valuing the risks at a constant higher level of impact and likelihood than the older generation. So actually maybe during my youth, I've been seeing lots of beautiful programs on television about David Attenborough, the English naturalist who worked for the BBC. He's been studying the world for 7 decades with all kinds of images all over the world, from the Great Barrier Reef, going to the Amazon, going to all kinds of animals and fish and birds and so on. And what he says, that quote, that really took me. He says, what we do in the next few years will determine the next few thousand years. Well, think about that. And that brings me to the power. I already highlighted that a little bit earlier on, but now the power and the way it is implemented in the real economy. Because on the one hand, we know, okay, we have those risks, those environmental risks, recognized by everybody. But on the other hand, the way these big companies are extracting the economy still is not included in actually our output, in GDP. And that's why, for example, the environmentalist Paul Hawkins said, we are stealing the future, selling it in the present and calling it GDP. Well, it's time, and after the crisis in 2007, 2008, there was even a report on given by the initiative of the president then, Nicolas Sarkozy, when 3 important people, Nobel Prize winners, were asked, what can we do? Can we do something about the GDP? What should we include in those values and so on? Well-being and happiness and so on. But still, it has of course to do with the power, because those big corporations, I'm not only talking about big multinationals, but also big corporations, actually, they are using politics. They are influencing politics. They are actually also able to set up governments against each other. And that's why, personally, I think it's incredibly important to include politics into the economy, into the economics by laws, by policy, by legislations. So then I was thinking of the fact what is actually the purpose of economy, of the economic activity. And I was reading, well, I'm reading lots of stuff, and one of the things that actually caught my attention was a professor in Vienna, in Austria, and his name is Christian Felber, and I'm going to just drink a sip of water because my throat's a little bit dry. Okay. And he said, okay, he asked his students, what is the purpose of economic activity, of economics? Profits, maximizing profits, lots of volumes, and so on. So he said by himself, would that really be the purpose of economics? I'm going to dig into this. And well, he came across, and the first thing he studied was actually the constitution of the state of Bavaria. That's a southern state in Germany. And while he was reading the constitution, he literally read, the purpose of all economic activity is to serve the common good. First of all, he thought, no, I'm mistakenly reading this, what I'm reading here. But he read it again, and yes, he read what he just was thinking. Then he went to other constitutions, Germany, Italy, Colombia, and even the most capitalistic country in the world, the US. And guess what? All the same. It is to serve the common good. So actually then, the question there is, okay, the common good, it does combine actually free trade, liberalism, but it is with ethics. And the ethics is a very important thing, because when you think of the risks, if we in 10 years we want to keep on talking about environmental risks without changing that business model, we're going to have the same kind of reports over and over again. So there's lots of things happening in that area, and one of the things I wanted to actually to talk about is a small example, for example, in the city of Ghent, my home country, where they're talking about the commons. Commons actually are human institutions. And one of the things is, during a crisis, during history of the crisis over the past 5,000 years, people have always been having the tendency, because they were living in social competitive classes, to overuse resources in terms of crises. And after that, it came back to institutions like the commons to gather together. And an example is, for example, a car sharing association in Ghent, where they say, okay, for every 10 people you have one car, and we guarantee full mobility. And it works. It works in 100% of the cases. It works, and what does it mean? 10 times less material, 10 times less plastics, 10 times less energy use. Oh, this is smart. If you can organize that in cities around the whole city, that would be a very interesting thing. So actually, everything is about life. And I'm actually already skipping this next slide because I see the time is consuming as well. But I want to come up with 3 specific examples that serve life, that are already happening as we are talking now, yes, that are not ideas, that are really things that happen in practice around the world, because many things are happening around the world. And the first thing is Singapore, and I called it the social Singapore. Well, Singapore is known for its economic outperformance, as we all know it, and the financial press says, okay, it's stressing on the fact that it's easy to trade with that city-state, and also that actually the investors' friendliness, they are very open to attract investments from abroad. But what nobody tells you, what hardly is known, are these figures. 90% of the land is owned by the government. 85% of housing is provided by the government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises. And let me get into this a little in detail. A couple of years ago, the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore was asked, what is the single most important measure that ever has been taken since the country became independent? And he said, social policy. Oh, social policy, how come? Well, he was referring to the housing estates. What did they do? When the country was formed, it had a diverse ethnic variation of people coming from all kinds of places. And what did the government do? They said, we are going to make sure that in every apartment, in every block, in every precinct, when we are putting people there, we are going to provide social housing, so that the blueprint of the diversity of our community is represented in those buildings, in those areas. It was an experiment by the time. They didn't know what to expect, but it seemed to be the most important measure ever. And what does it mean? Children grow up together. They play in the same neighborhood. They go to the same school. Parents, they talk to each other. They are used to all kinds of diversity. So actually, this is a beautiful example of life. It exists. It is not science fiction. A second thing is, what I would like to talk about to you in a short notice, is the steward ownership. Steward ownership actually refers to new kind of business models, where actually there are 2 key principles. The first one is self-governance. And what does that mean? Self-governance means that they are only working with people that are really committed to the company, working in the company, that are very actually in terms with the purpose of the company. To give you an idea, it would be impossible for a hedge fund manager in Hong Kong to have any decision right on the ownership of this company. So actually the ownership is 100% guaranteed. The companies cannot be sold. And how come? Because they set up foundations that are taking care of these companies through, well, well-written articles in their specific statutes. And the important thing is that they make a distinction between economic and voting rights. It's not because you're an investor and you're investing in that company that you have anything to say about the policy or the purpose of the company. Is this something that exists since yesterday? No, it already exists for many, many years. There's many benefits to these companies. They are better resilient against crises. They hire the best people, are able to hire the best people. And I get the notion. And they are actually more productive have a higher profit margin compared to the mainstream companies. And these are 3 companies that I'm just showing you. And one of them, well, I was lucky to see that one of these companies, also a beer company, is a company Carlsberg, who actually is an example of a steward ownership company and has set up a foundation. And that foundation is then also, actually the money is or reinvested in the company or spent for scientific research and all kinds of healthcare and other services. And the last example, the last very example I want to show and share with you is food. Because, for example, here in Curacao, we are dependent on food. We don't have our own food. There is no food security on the island. The real situation, as we are talking of today, is that the food is in hands of only a couple of players worldwide. They have the monopoly power. And actually, they are based on monocultures, using lots of chemicals in order to, well, increase what they call the yield per acre as much as they can. Food is a commodity in that business model. But there is another food community that is already existing all over the world and also in small places, small islands. I've seen it with my own eyes. And I am inspired here by Vandana Shiva, who you can see there on the left bottom side of the sheet. And she says, she's actually a quantum physicist. She is an environmentalist, and she's also a food advocate. And she says, for me, food sovereignty is sovereignty over your life, livelihood, and health. And what I'm going to tell now is very important. It begins with seed sovereignty. Why is she saying seed sovereignty? Because in many parts of the world, seeds are owned, actually are patented by these big international companies. Farmers have to pay almost all of their resources in order to survive to produce the agricultural products. But it's not necessary, because actually everything that grows in nature is not invented by humans. It was there already. So this is going to be a very big issue for the future, and positive things are going on. So she actually implemented the economic division of preparing laws and talking and sensibilizing and governments all over the world to actually get along with that organic food structure. That could be very interesting also for small communities. So to end then with the last sheet, and for the French spectators here among us in the virtual community, there is a saying, "Science sans conscience n'est que ruine de l'âme." Well, what does that mean? If you looked at the left side of the slide, you see one monoculture, palm trees. What does that mean? It kills biodiversity. We don't want that, because it's already recognized as environmental risks. We want the right side of the equation, which means the biodiversity, because there you can have economic development, economic diversity, resilience, and actually this was the theme of this international conference. I thank you.
Thank you to Guy Cousin for this, for another amazing speech. A very interesting and a very, diverse information we've received so far. We have received a number of questions, and I see that we have around 37 minutes left. So let's dig right into it. Okay, one question, let's see from the chat box. The pandemic impact has showed the most of the companies that with the use of technology, there is less need for having a lot of employees. As a matter of fact, the unemployed has risen lately, it says. So the question is, what might be the best solution to tackle this issue? So basically, less need for having employees in an already economy in which people are unemployment is already a lot. And continuing with the most of the companies prefer to lay off their employees and work. Okay. In Curacao, we have, in the Dutch, we say uitzendkracht. So people that's not really in, how do you say that? Working on a payroll, but they can come and they can go, and not regulated by law as such. So who wants to answer this question? What might be the best solution to tackle the issue of companies that with the use of technology need less employees is the question, if I may rephrase it. See, Dr. Shardim is smiling.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. I might take that question, and thank you for the question. As a matter of fact, I would say it's quite difficult to answer that question because the point is, what should you be tackling? Because if the pandemic has shown you that you can be more efficient and that you can use your resources in a completely different way, it's all about efficiency and also productivity. So that means that we should be using that discovery, as a matter of fact, that you can produce much using less resources to the benefit of the economy and to the benefit of the people that form the economy. So I don't consider it a challenge, or it is a challenge, but I don't consider it a problem. It's one of the opportunities that this crisis has granted us. It's like, for instance, that we have also concluded that you don't need to be every day at work physically, that you can also work from home, which is also, for instance, beneficial for the environment. So, as a matter of fact, these are one of the many opportunities that have been presented by this pandemic.
If we can go to another question for another topic, the fiscal activism. How do we interpret the fact that you have on the one side Curacao with a higher fiscal activism, but on the other side, the economy is shrinking faster if you compare it to the other islands? How should we interpret this, and what are we doing wrong then? So all our fiscal activism, all the measures by the government are, how should we interpret this? More fiscal activism and a more shrinking economy. So should the government lay off?
Joanna, I assume that question is for
yes.
me. Okay. Once again, if during the presentation what was shown is that the fiscal activism was much larger in Curacao compared to other areas in the region, and it was more or less comparable to other regions of the world. On the other hand, what we could also see is that most of that fiscal activism was used to finance the own government budget. So that means that the support for the private sector, which was relatively much more limited. So the point is that I think personally that it will require more research into this matter, but the fact that less funds were made available to assist the private sector may answer your question, so that that a more balanced approach was necessary, not only for the public sector but also to the private sector. What we should keep in mind is that we are exiting this crisis with a much smaller economy, with much more unemployment, and with a more indebted government. So that means that the challenges are really big. So the advantage would have been if the funds that have been used to more or less contain this crisis would have helped the island economy to more or less preserve the production capacity. And that's why I was emphasizing in the presentation, it's a question mark whether the recovery will be a fast one, because from the indications, from the data available right now, it will be a more challenging issue to recover the economy. So it has to do eventually with the need to rebalance, that we should have used the funds in a different way in the second place as well. What you can see is that it might be also an inevitable situation related to small open economies. In the presentation, it was also emphasized the fiscal multipliers in this kind of economies is much smaller than when you look, for instance, at the EU or the US. So that means that even when you spend a lot of money, that does not necessarily mean that you will be able to contain the economic damage.
So in other words, going back from the presentation as well, you could say that the fact that we had much more above-the-line measures as comparison to below-the-line measures in Curacao is maybe part of the problem, but then the question is, what could we have done differently if we compare it, even to bring everyone's presentation together? Mr. Girigori was talking about these business retention programs and how necessary they were, which is in case the reason of the spending as well. How can we bring this together? What could we have done differently then as an island with the pandemic and with the measures? Could we have done anything differently?
Who starts?
We have economists, 3 economists on the panel.
You start.
We're interested in your point of view.
I think we did it, everything that we could do. Actually, as I mentioned within my presentation, and Shardim has mentioned it too, is that we have to work on the structural part of the economy. I'm thinking for sure, for one of the first steps that we did, and I think that every country has did the same, is to the business retention steps in order to stop the bleeding from the private sector. My point is then the question remained indeed the amount of support which went to the government, which that part for the support of the budget was a huge part of the money that we receive. But in any case, it is a circumstance that we are going through right now, but we have to go back in terms of shifting from a certain part of tax that we are right now, the way that we earning that, in actually shifting from direct tax that we have right now to indirect, in order for the government, in my case, to get more money. And besides that, working, and for sure we have to thinking about the work of the future, because indeed the economy is changing rapidly. And one thing that we have to do, besides the fact that we have to work on the structure of the economy, we have to look for what type of work we will see within the future that will be needed. And for sure, working with our education, as Sadi mentioned, also the education is one of the parts. I mentioned too, within the labor market is one of the parts that we have to work on. You have to keep in mind that you have to have a education that can change very fast and act very fast on the changing of the economy, in order to prepare those people for the coming work that we expected that will be in the future. Because if you ask me did we did something wrong, I don't think that we did something wrong. What we have to do right now is creating the opportunity, increasing the productivity, look into the economy, the structure of the economy, and then start to promoting and attract investment within certain niche markets.
A very important question and very important answers as well as to your thoughts on this matter. Of course, we are still in pandemic times. COVID is very much still here. I mean, in Curacao, we have a very successful vaccination program going on, but this is something that will take a while. So it's important to see if the kind of measures we are taking as an island and others watching as well, how effective they were, to see if you should continue in that matter or not. So labor market flexibilization of the labor market was brought up, and then the question is, if you see strengthening of economic structure in the post-COVID era, at first glance seems like quite a challenge. So labor market more than ever is susceptible to change in regard in this situation. So can you say that flexibilization of the labor market can have a counterproductive effect on the economy? Because flexibilization of the labor market in Curacao is something, I'm sure in different countries as well, something we've been hearing for many, many years in discussion, so it's controversial. The question is, why is it taking so much, and can it be counterproductive in its effect on the economy?
Okay, let's start with the first question. Why is it taking so long? I think political motivation to change things, political vision to say we have to do something within on the labor market. Actually, scared to take a decision that politically can be paid off within the coming election for those that are the Minister of Social. My point is, there are several things that you have to do, and we're not saying that you will have to have a labor law that you can hire and fire people when you want. The question is, well, that you have to have a labor market which is more flexible. By meaning, if you have a crisis time, you have to have the instrument to handle as a crisis. And if you have some, you are preparing right now people from the education which are not matching actually those type of work that the private sector wants. Because those things you have to put in place that you will prevent and talking about to having a better, what do you call that? Increasing the productivity. One of the things to increase the productivity is to have a good alignment between the education and the need of the private sector. Those things are things that you can do right now. They are part of the law. To mention some part from, if you want to bring somebody from abroad, you have to take 11 weeks to evaluate if you have those people within the economy of Curacao on the island. And the question is, why do you have to take so long? It can take 2 or 3 weeks. You can solve that. Because those kind of barriers that we have within the laws of the labor market, those are the things that we have to change. But of course, indeed, it takes political will and political power to get into that.
Guy Kozijn, you spoke a lot about things we could learn, I would say, from, for example, other countries. You talked about the social Singapore. Singapore is a country here in Curacao. They always say we can compare ourselves to. Of course, you brought the very interesting points. There are many other interesting points as to how we are not, how you cannot compare us to the social situation in Singapore. But what would you say specifically in this post-COVID era, Curacao or countries like us could learn or take from the way Singapore is handling its economy?
Well, maybe it's interesting to give a little perspective on the history there. When the country was becoming independent, actually nobody believed they would, or hardly anybody believed they would survive, because actually they had no natural resources, no mountains, no waterfalls, so they could not, let's say, invoke thermal energy. All the markets around Singapore actually were more competitive than they were. So actually, it was almost a recipe to fail, as to see it that way. But then, of course, they embarked on a vision, on a mission. Actually, that's a mission they stated. And for example, if you then would make a comparison, for example, to the local situation here, one of the things also, for example, in the European community they have done is that they have actually set a couple of missions for the next decade. A mission on food and healthy soil, for example, a mission on the biodiversity. These are missions. And what does that mean? It means that when you are thinking of the mission, you're actually putting the intention in place. And it means that as you are working it out, for example, clean growth or mobility, or the other two examples I gave, it means that once you have worked out that concept, then you're going to see what are, in an organic way, the sectors that will play a role in this development. And that's actually another approach than defining, first of all, these are the sectors and this is what could happen. I think policies that are well worked out and in place could be a very valuable information for example, the local situation over here, because there you are very right. The situation, every locality is different. So you have to deal with different circumstances, other people, and so on. But the concepts and the innovations that are already working elsewhere, yeah. And I'm going to give you one practical example, an example that I personally experienced. It was on an island, a small island, called by Christopher Columbus the end of the world. I was there in 2016. And the island did not have its own water. What has happened if you don't have your own water? It had to import the water from a neighboring country. What does that mean? You're actually not able to have any economic development because you're paying outside. So I'm cutting the story short. The contribution of the agricultural sector there was around 0.5%. Nowadays, because they have a renewable energy, 100% renewable energy over there, agriculture increased from 0.5% to a figure between 6 and 8% of GDP. This is amazing. Why? Because, and then I'm referring to Mr. Jardim, what he said about the fact that the multiplier, actually the fact that we are importing so much, that weakens the multiplier. Well, you are actually substituting the food, you're creating your own food security, and actually nowadays they are actually producing everything. The only thing that they are importing, as I understood, are chicken and eggs. Don't ask me why, but that's the way it is. But just to give you an example, these things are already happening. So why not going to that island, El Hierro, is the island, and look at the concepts? Because for them it was first about the purpose. What is the purpose that we want to achieve? And then they were thinking about, well, the means to achieve that. And one of the means to achieve that is money, of course.
Can an economy, and maybe to throw the question back at Dr. Jardim, can an economy like ours now carry a change and a reshuffle of economic sectors? Because our history as Curacao, if we want to compare ourselves to other islands in the Caribbean, we have a longer history of having a diverse economy, like you also stated, more economic pillars as to just tourism that were, helping our GDP. We know that these last years our problem is more stated because we lost some pillars. But can our economy that's so fragile now handle a whole reshuffling, like Guy is saying, of creating a different vision and working towards that? Or is that a dangerous game in such a fragile situation amidst a pandemic?
As a matter of fact, the economy has been transforming for the last 2 decades, more or less. If you look at, for instance, at the manufacturing sector, it has shrank over the last 2 decades substantially, and that has to do with the refocus in the economy. So the economy is already used to that transforming. The point is, are we properly focusing and are we replacing economic activities that are even productive as the former ones? Because you may replace economic activities, you may keep a diversified economy, but it is also very important for you to be aware that once one economic pillar disappears or shrinks, that may affect the level of social being in the economy as well, and that's what Curacao has been experiencing for almost 1 decade. We saw from Mr. Grigori's presentation the economic growth figures of the last decade, if I'm not mistaken, and what you see is that the economy was already shrinking. That is mainly due to the disappearance of one of the main economic pillars, the refinery of oil. But if that sector disappears because there is no possibility to preserve that sector, what we should be doing is more or less making sure that our people are capable to develop other economic activities that are preferably even productive as the old ones. And that's the challenge that we have. I don't think that we should be looking at economic transformation as an issue. It's inevitable. Every economy experiences that over its life cycle. What is really important is that the economic reforms are no longer delayed. So if we look, for instance, right now, we have been experiencing the pandemic for 1.5 years. And as a matter of fact, we all saw during this session the figures of especially Curacao, much higher unemployment, smaller economy, more public debt, and so on. But the point is, once that you enter the pandemic and that you are more or less 6 months later, you can expect that the picture won't be that positive at the end of the road. So that means that you need to prepare the economy for the recovery, and that's what we can no further delay. And the need for economic structural reforms, it's really important to make sure that the economic recovery is going to take place in a fast way. I would also want to couple it with the other question that you asked, whether labor flexibilization would harm the economy. I think that if you look at the current figures, the lack of flexibility, so the rigidity of the labor market, it contributed to the growth of the unemployment from 17 to 24%. So we should look at things the other way around. So flexibilization is very important, but the point is you need to do it also in a socially responsible way. So that's the way that you should balance the reforms as well.
We have a question that's related to this flexibilization. One of the bullet points it says in Luelo's Girigori's presentation were about flexible work hours, temporary reduction in working time. Can he explain that? Because so the question states, now Curacao wants to be more flexible, while the Netherlands announced that they don't want all that flexibility, more vaste contracten, less flexible contracts, no zero-hour contracts, a higher minimum of hourly wage for the what we call then ZZP'ers.
But actually, if you go back, if you compare us with Netherlands started some years ago when the working labor market was a little bit rigid. They started introducing those type of measures. Actually, zero contract contract for the workers. And actually, on Curacao, we didn't react on the swing of the economy. Which means that actually when we saw from, there are certain measures that we have to take in order to make the economy or to make the labor market more flexible, we didn't take those action. And actually we are confronting right now from things that we have to do, that we have been, has done in the past that we didn't did at due time. And actually now we're confronted with a market that have to be changed. Like we have a crisis that you have to say from, we need for a certain period a less working hour in order to keep all those workers in place so we don't have to fire nobody. Actually, the law didn't give us the space to do that. The point is that we have to go back and see from, in which extent do we have to make our labor law more flexible in order for us to can guarantee within the future that we can react on certain pandemic of crisis that present. And actually, if we can be more resilient as an economy as its whole. Dus actually, those measures that we have to take regarding the labor market are very essential. And it's not only from changing the law that we have right now, like I mentioned, from if you want to bring somebody from abroad, the amount of time that it takes before you can just get some worker that you need from abroad, those things have to be more flexible. They have to be more compliance to the economic reality that we have right now. And actually, by saying that, it means not only that we have to just take those action and on short notice if we want to see the economy that it will start growing for the coming years, but we have to take in consideration too. Besides the pandemic that we have, if we need for the future, if there is several problems and things that present, we are not able to handle that. We will get in the same situation that we have before, during the COVID time, owing to the fact that we have a very rigid labor market laws.
So labor market is a real issue to tackle.
Is one of the issues that we have to tackle.
If I may go to a different question, different area of this topic. Here in Curacao, we have a supervisory law, Rijkswet Financieel Toezicht, which states we have certain very strict restrictions as to our budget deficit, compensation thereof. Is this the reason why our economy is not growing? Because you cannot ride the wave and you cannot play with this economic cycle you are in, but you are restricted because you have to have that budget deficit compensated every year.
Okay, may I start? Mr. Grigoris presented the economic growth figures for Curacao for the last couple of years. But if you were to look at the figures for the last 30 years, and the one kingdom law that you are talking about was introduced back in 2010. So that means that it has been in place for 11 years. But if you look at the economic growth figures of Curacao, for instance, the economic growth for the last 3 decades is more or less zero. So that means that fiscal discipline is not the issue. The issue is the reforms that you keep delaying and that are affecting economic growth. Fiscal discipline would grant you the possibility, as a matter of fact, for instance, to do the necessary investments in the areas that are really necessary. For instance, in education. I highlighted that point as well in my presentation. Education should go hand in hand with the labor market reform. You have currently a very important mismatch between supply and demand on the labor market. You need to prepare the employees for the new jobs. And the lack of resources is making that also very difficult. So fiscal discipline, and you look at, you have some experience here in Curacao, 3 decades prior to that kingdom law, the economic growth was not there either. But if you look at other economies as well, fiscal discipline is not proven to be an issue for economic growth. It actually supports economic growth.
So our problem is that we delay action, and that we've been delaying action for a few decades now, if I can summarize you all correctly.
If I may react on that one, look, until 2 or 3 decades ago, we didn't have a global economy like we know it right now. So once that you are part of the global economy, you should be aware that your economic structures won't remain in place for decades like it used to be in the past. You need to be much more flexible in adjusting to the new challenges. So that means that once that you are part of the global economy, you should be aware and be prepared to make major reforms in a much more earlier, but also faster. So that means that if in the past, until the 16, you could introduce a reform that would remain in place for 10 or 20 years, that won't be the case right now. You need to be prepared to reform today and be able to reform it eventually over 3 to 5 years, because the economy is much more dynamic than it used to be. So that means you need to be ready to keep reforming in a more or less continuous way to make the economy resilient.
Guy, you spoke about, thank you very much, Dr. Shardim. Guy, you spoke about global risks by likelihood and by impact. If we can stop for a second by impact, if we look at 2020 and 2021, even though they vary a little, you could say in both, in the top majority is related to environment. If we can bring it to a local issue, but also an issue of other islands in the Caribbean right now, and very, very much recent discussion due to a court case yesterday in Curacao about the refinery. What does this mean for the development of economy for islands like Curacao that are still envisioning their economy and a major part of that to be based on a sector that we know is part of one of the top global risks as such, and that has an expiration date as well?
That's a big question, you know. So actually, look, if you are changing, transforming, well, an economy, you need to have an alternative in place, of course. You just can't say, okay, this is stranded assets, and we have no alternative in place. But what could help is that when you set out a mission for the next decade, and this is, I think, very important for the island, and to set a clear economic vision for the next decades, and the economic design, where things are also connected to each other. We're talking about labor market and technology. Actually, technology and job losses, it's kind of, well, it's kind of a thing that comes out in many studies, that when you have technology, you're going to have less, you're going to need less people. But it depends actually on the purpose. What is the purpose of your company? What do you want to achieve with your company? And technology can be a very interesting tool to achieve that. So it does not effectively need to impact, let's say, get away of jobs substantially. It all comes down to what is the real purpose. So with respect, of course, to the refinery, what could help is, for example, for the next decade, that we also know, okay, if we, for example, would have a mission of clean growth, just to give an example, what actually do we mean by that? Well, let's scrutinize that. What do we mean by that? What are the consequences? And then how can the community embark on that clean growth mission, and what kind of sectors can contribute to that? But of course, the CO2, the world is, you hear it everywhere, and with the Paris Agreement, the decarbonization of the world because of the global warming, which is, well, so much present in all these risks. It is a risk, we know that, so we don't need to walk away from that. It is there. So then the question is, how are you going to deal with that?
Thank you for your answer. I see that we have about 6 minutes left, so I want to ask a more general, in a more general sense, a question that I think all three of you could answer. And it's something that applies or could apply your answer not only to Curacao but also different countries, because we are living in times of crisis. This whole international conference, the theme is economic resilience and sustainable development in times of crisis. So many or most countries have to deal with measures. Government had to take decisions as to health of people and the economy, etc. So, but then the question comes now, we're still in the COVID pandemic, we have to think towards the future. The question is it time now, seeing as how many problems countries have to face and deal with and reorganize, for a bigger government that's, for example, with more taxes or generating more income or more there in the business of people to be able to carry all these structural changes and policies that are needed to come out of a crisis? Or is it time for the governments to lay off, cut down, leave everything to the free market and put everything into the private sector and let the market do its work?
Can I start?
Yes.
Okay. Again, a big question, if you ask me. I think if you look at the economic models, because we have different economic models, there's many schools. You have the classics, the neoliberalists, you have the Marxists, you have the Keynesians, and so on. Just to point out the example of Singapore, not one economic model could explain the success of Singapore, not one. So the first thing that is important, seems important to me is, and there I'm following Professor Chang from the Cambridge University, he says we need all those different models to work together. So economists come along, work together, but you can't do it alone. You need those multidisciplinary people. You need also people who are with their hands in the mud to see and show what really is out there, what's at stake. So that's one important thing. What was the other part of the question? So
bigger government or government?
So I think bigger government or not, with the things that are going on right now, I think the real issue is, what is your mission for the future? What do you want for the next decade? Embark upon that. Just to give an example, in Europe, for example, or maybe in the United States, in the times of the Apollo project and the mission to the moon, yes, what happened there was that actually first they put the mission, the president, even Kennedy already said, we want to be the first country that, with humanity having its first step on the moon. And that was, of course, an incredible project in terms of, well, the view and the image of the Americans to the world. They succeeded, but what started then? The mission was going to the moon. They didn't know what was exactly going to happen. But as a consequence of that, well, we need to build that rocket. It needs to be resistant. It needs to be able to cope with big temperature differences. Oh, we also need textiles. Oh, we also need food, because when they go in the outer space, we need food. So all kinds of sectors, as a consequence of that mission, contributed to that to actually that effective launch somewhere at the end of the 60s.
So have a vision and then see which model
what is your mission?
best fits.
What's the mission?
We have a few minutes left, and I want to be able to give a few short minutes to Mr. Girigori, because we are already quite tight with on schedule.
I think government intervention is a need if you're talking about the economy of Curacao. In terms that I'm thinking from you have to prepare the economy. Two things that are very important is that the measures that the government have to take, put in place, actually to facilitate the economy. And those actions, you cannot leave it behind that the private sector have to take those actions, because the aim of the private sector is different as the aim of the government. Because you have to have a government which intervenes within the economy. What we have to take note of is that we have to see from, okay, within the future we have to have an economy that will be in certain place that it can take of change measure, of put measure in place that be in advance of the economy to take care that the economy will keep on growing. And actually the intervention is, from my part of view, a needed part of the process within the growing of the economy.
Thank you. Dr. Shardim?
I would say that if you look at the public apparatus, the size, you should first determine what's the objective of the public apparatus. Public apparatus is mainly there to assist the society. So that means that you should shape the public apparatus in a proper way that it is able to comply with its tasks. The tasks are not eternally defined. You can reshape those as well. But if we look at the size, and then I would like to relate it to one of your first questions from the audience, which said, in this crisis, we have discovered that companies have discovered that they can produce the same with less employees. The question is, why should that apply only to the private sector and not also to the public sector? So that means that you should be open to reanalyze the reality and to determine what public apparatus do you need. But that also depends on the kind of legislation that you have in place. Mr. Girigori was mentioning that the idea is to limit in one specific branch the number of licenses from 10 to 2. Of course, if you are issuing 10 licenses, you need much more people. But once that you are concentrating on the 2 vital licenses, that means that eventually less resources are needed, or the same resources could be used in a more productive, in a more facilitating way towards the private sector. Because the economy is not going to grow because the government is growing. The economy is only going to grow if the private economy is growing, if the market economy is growing.
Thank you, Dr. Shardim. We have to conclude today's session on economic impact. I want to thank all three of you for your very valuable input, insights, for the presentations, for your answers and dynamic in answering these questions. I'm sure we could have stayed here for another 2, 3, 4 hours and discussed very interesting topics for the public as well. But don't worry, because this international conference and these local sessions in Curacao that you can tune in as locals from Curacao, but as well all our global participants for this 21st International Conference. We still have 2 days to go. Tomorrow we will be having a session on the fiscal impact, the financial impact, I mean, and the education, the impact on the education from the COVID-19. I'm sure these are very interesting topics to be discussing as well. We can conclude not only from this session from this afternoon, but in the morning as well, that these are challenging times. But as was said in the introduction of this conference as well, the greatest glory is not in how many times you fall, but how many times you get back up. And as was stated as well, there's always, always, always a time to bounce back, and the time is now. So it is very important to have these discussions. Think about it. Have a different idea, but this is the dynamic that's necessary if you look historically for countries and for the whole world community as a whole, plus to go forward into a better future, which is, I think, everyone's goal. Of course, from the diversity point of view, as part of this international conference on diversity in organizations, communities, and nations, which we are having now. I want to thank you all for your attendance, and we will see you tomorrow again, 10 a.m. The same link you can use. Be sure, and you are free, of course, to share this link with everyone you think will find it interesting to follow these very interesting discussions. For my part, Joanda Costa Gomez, I thank you. Bye.